Gabby was officially reported missing, I jumped right in. I went right into first responder mode. I didn't go into a dad mode. I didn't go into a husband mode. I didn't know how to comfort and console. I said, I'm going to find our daughter. I'm endangering her home. At that time, I thought everything in my career had prepared me for it. But I was horribly wrong.
Here you on 8. You on 8. Okay, you're clear. Stand by for your base. Line clear, number 2, go ahead.
These are the calls that haunt you, not because you made a clinical mistake or because the outcome was bad, because you didn't realize. And maybe there's no reason you would have, but you can't stop asking yourself if there's something you missed that would have clued you into what was actually happening on that scene. Domestic violence calls are like that for a lot of medics. And paramedic school gave you almost nothing for them. No framework, no language to use, no protocol for recognizing what you're actually walking into and how to navigate it. Today's guest is Jim Schmidt, a retired firefighter with 20 plus years in emergency services as a firefighter, fire officer, EMS instructor. He's been on those calls. He knows what the field looks like from inside out. He also lost his stepdaughter, Gabby Petito, to an intimate partner homicide in 2021. You may know that name because of the uniqueness of the case. It made national news. And in the news coverage, you may have seen a police cam footage from a stop that occurred just weeks before her murder, when police were notified of a potential domestic violence incident. Watching that video is tragic and heartbreaking, knowing the outcome. And as I stated just a moment ago, is a call that likely haunts every first responder who was there that day. After losing Gabby, Jim co-founded the Gabby Petito Foundation. The mission is domestic violence awareness and first responder education, because the gap between what paramedics are trained to do on domestic violence calls and what actually needs to happen on a domestic violence call is wide. He published a piece in GEMS last October on educating first responders to recognize domestic violence. He's given this work everything he has, traveling across the country to give EMS agencies the education we desperately need to participate in search parties for missing victims. He's here today to talk to Will and me about what first responders are getting wrong on these calls, what they don't know they're missing, and what they can actually do differently starting on their next shift. Nobody teaches paramedics how to see what's happening on a domestic violence call. You're expected to figure it out. Jim spent 4 years making sure you don't have to figure it out alone. Let's get into it. Jim, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be on here and continue to spread our mission for advocacy and training to such a wide audience. So thank you for having me today.
No, thank you. It's such important work that you're doing. And as usual, I have Will Berry, my co-host here. Will, welcome.
Yeah, thank you. And Jim, one of my most memorable calls that I still think about frequently was one where I barely did any paramedic level care. We were actually on a SWAT standby. And of course, as a street paramedic, you think it's pretty cool to be working with the SWAT team. And then over the radio, they said, we have a patient for you. And they brought a woman down that had been hiding in the attic from her domestic partner and had been abused in unknown kind of ways. And I transported her to the hospital and had no idea the best way to care for her. The wounds, known and unknown, that were not obvious. And so, yeah, this is something that needs to be brought to EMS providers in a way that they can serve the community even better. So thank you.
No problem. Thank you. Yeah, and that's a conversation I hear more and more often, or I'm hearing from medics out there that after I go through like the first part of the training, talking about domestic violence and getting into some statistics, it's like a light bulb goes off in their head, and it takes them back to that time when they had a call or calls that now stand out to them. And you're realizing like, wow, like that was domestic violence. I had no idea at the time. And so it's definitely one of those things I say all the time, like you don't know what you don't know. And I don't blame any of us out there on the streets that don't have the experience to recognize it. We don't we don't often stress it in our EMT and medic programs. It's in the textbook. It's there. It's been the same couple of paragraphs for years, decades, probably even longer in there. They really need to be updated. There's typically no questions on the state exam, so they don't really cover it. And yet, when we're doing interviews with medics out on the street or we're doing surveys, over 80% of our medics out there in the field are saying, yeah, we're responding to these, but we have no training in it. And so it's definitely a huge gap. And once our folks out there start learning about it, they want more information on it. They want to know how to be able to support these patients better in that moment and how to make that connection, because they can be extremely frustrating calls to go on. And so we're trying to bridge that gap and get that education out there, teaching trauma-informed care, which we already do in different contexts. We don't approach a pediatric call the same as we do for any old call on the street. We tend to look at those a little differently. We kind of connect with that child on a different level. And that's kind of what we have to do in these situations too. So yeah, absolutely. Very important stuff.
With all of that in mind, as we prepare to dive deep into this topic, can you just set us up with a set of principles that we're going to focus on as we go through all of this?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I had no idea what domestic violence was. And even I responded to these calls. And even when we were experiencing everything with our daughter at that time, and when the body cam footage came out from Moab, even after she was found murdered, I don't think it clicked inside my head that our daughter was a victim of domestic violence. For me, it was often what we see on TV, how it's sensationalized or dramatized or whatever. And so I really had to dig deep into it to try to understand it. And it wasn't until I was in a court deposition as part of everything that we had gone through, and the opposing attorney was really grilling me on my training and my experience, and was asking me about my training in domestic violence. And I said I had none. And he had a hard time believing that I spent a career helping people and responding to incidents like this, and I had zero training. And so I started doing a lot of research on it and realizing that there was only a couple of states that really mandated for EMS providers. Some information out there, there was really no robust training program out there, and yet we're responding to these calls. And so I dug in really deep on it. And we're even looking at some of these documents that I found for survivors of domestic violence who felt like they were more trapped by interactions with us because we didn't know or how we treated them, or assumptions that biases that we tend to have. And so just trying to change that mindset, because they are difficult calls. So just kind of setting up for today, just kind of really talking about what domestic violence truly is, how prominent it is out there, how we can respond to these calls, how we can be more trauma informed in these incidents, and also understanding some neurobiology of trauma, what happens to the brain. And honestly, it's not too different from what we experience when we respond to a traumatic event. And so we train for that stuff, though. We train every day to put ourselves in high stress situations. So when we come up to that incident, hopefully our brain will remember how to get us through it. When somebody who's experiencing abuse, their brain is being rewired and they don't have that training. And so they present much differently to us. So understanding why they're behaving the way they are, how we can connect to them. And then ultimately, if we can recognize early on signs of strangulation, which a victim often refers to as choking, and how to support that patient and ultimately get them to the emergency room is what they need, because there may be a whole slew of underlying severe and potentially lethal implications if they don't go.
I think the story of Gabby is really important because it provides some meaning and a sense of reality. This is real. This happens to people as they listen to what we're going to talk about. But I also want to acknowledge and be sensitive to the fact that this was real, more real than for anyone else, for you. Like, nobody expects this to happen to their family member. And it sounds like you've really gone into a deep dive surrounding these issues to try to help after this event. What's some of the more surprising things you've learned when doing your research?
Yeah, I mean, I spent a career educating myself because I didn't ever want to come upon a situation where I didn't know what to do, or at least who to call and how to get those answers. And so when Gabby was officially reported missing, I jumped right in. I went right into first responder mode. I didn't go into a dad mode. I didn't go into a husband mode. I know how to comfort and console. I said, I'm going to find our daughter. I'm going to bring her home. And so I'm the one who had to identify her body when she was found September 19th, 2021. And I realized at that time, I feel like everything in my career had prepared me for it. But I was horribly wrong. And so I really took it hard in a lot of ways. I felt like I had failed as a father to protect our daughter. But then looking back on my career, I felt like I unintentionally had failed a lot of patients that I responded to that, or in these similar situations, by not knowing. And so when I started educating myself on it, and the numbers are changing. The thing to remember about statistics too is we know that domestic violence and sexual assault crimes, first off, those are two crimes that we do a severe disservice to the victims, because immediately the victim is to blame. If somebody's in a domestic violence situation, well, why don't you just leave? It would make sense. If you're being severely abused, just leave. But it's not that simple. It's not easy for them. A sexual assault victim, the very first thing is, well, what were you wearing? Were you drinking? Why were you there? We don't question if a burglar breaks into our house. What were you wearing at the time when they broke in? Right away, we blame these victims immediately instead of trying to understand what they're going through. It's a lot. So it used to be 1 in 4. Now it's 1 in 3 women will be victims of severe domestic violence in their lifetime. 1 in 7 men. It affects children. It affects our schools. It affects our healthcare system. More than 15% of ER visits each year are domestic violence related, whether it's reported as such or not. And it's happening all the time. The FBI just released a report from 2020 to 2024, and it's through their national incident-based reporting system. And in that 5-year period, there was 11,466 domestic violence homicides in this country. And so the number we used to say was 3 women a day are victims of domestic violence homicide. 80% of that 11,000 are women. So doing the math, that number's up to 5 a day. And what's also important to remember about that data is only 75.5% of law enforcement agencies are reporting their data to the FBI. And so that number is far higher than that. So we're looking at 6 to 7 people a day are being murdered by somebody who's supposed to love and care for them. And it doesn't always start with the physical violence. Oftentimes we think of domestic violence as the physical violence, but there are so many red flags beforehand that lead up to a non-physical forms of abuse that occur. And it's about gaining and maintaining power and control. Gaining and maintaining power and control over an intimate part of the various means. And if somebody was to hit you on the first date, you probably wouldn't date them again after that, right? You'd run away. That's not how it works. So once they get in there, they make them the center of the world. They love bomb them. You're their everything. They need you. And then slowly the non-physical things start taking over: the isolation from your friends and family, the financial abuse, the emotional abuse, breaking down your whole sense of self. And then from there, it typically escalates into the physical violence. And it reprograms their brain. It does. Most domestic violence survivors will tell you over 30, 40 years out of that, they'll tell you that all of their physical injuries have healed. But what sticks with them to this very day is the emotional and mental trauma that they've experienced, where just a smell or a sight or a sound is enough to bring them back to when they were being abused.
When we see and talk about these cases, we're always at the point where the physical violence is happening, but understanding that dynamic that kind of led up to that point is something we don't often think about. Talk to me more about why it's important for us as EMS providers to recognize the prevalence of this, as you were just talking about, as well as that dynamic of domestic violence.
Absolutely, because we're going to these calls often, and it might not even come in as a domestic violence call. It might come in as a substance abuse issue, right? An overdose or an intox. It might come in as a psychological mental health issue. And sometimes if we're just not aware of it, we're like, oh, okay, it's 2 o'clock in the morning. Why are we here? And not really looking deeper into it. And so for us, it's understanding and recognizing the scene. What is the scene clues telling us? Is the story that you're being told, is the dynamics in the room, is everything kind of adding up to what I'm hearing? And understanding that if it's not, that there's probably something a little bit more going on. And how do we connect with this person? They see us much differently than they see law enforcement, right? I think I joke often in classes. I spend a lot of time with law enforcement now. And I don't know if you know this, they kind of have this little rivalry with firefighters and stuff. We kind of think all we do is play like pickleball and take naps in chairs and go grocery shopping. We do that stuff, but it's, pickleball's physical fitness. But, they oftentimes, they see law enforcement as just that, as someone's going to get arrested, very guarded towards them. Maybe we'll open up to them. But we're much different. At least they see us, we're helpers. And if we're not approaching them the right way, or if we're very judgmental in our interactions, they're not gonna speak to us. And we get frustrated when we get those repeat calls at the same place over and over again. But if we make that connection the very first time with them and get them to the hospital if that's where they need to be, or at least know the local resources to provide them, it's going to go a long way with them. It's going to show them for the first time that they're being seen, they're being heard. Somebody is believing in what I'm saying, and they're giving me choices, because they don't have the ability to make choices for themselves. And it can start that process of safety for them and knowing that there's a safe way out.
Jim, one thing I love is pulling on these predictable patterns that you mentioned that, but these are things that to somebody that's done a deep dive in a topic like this, they're obvious to you and they're great to teach. They're not obvious when you've only been through paramedic school and you're kind of just trial by fire on the street. Now, without getting into some of the physical exam findings, which I know we're going to get to those as one of these relationships escalates into violence. But again, I think this is important. Will you hit on some of the predictable patterns of behavior that can be early warning signs that one of these relationships is unhealthy and dangerous?
Yeah. So we say it all the time. If it's predictable, it's preventable, right? If there's a pattern, we can predict it. And so understanding certain cues in the behavior. So when you come upon a scene, you always want to look out to see who's the one speaking to you, who's being quiet. If the person that you're responding to, say it's a woman, and you got to fall. Maybe it came in as like an injury from a fall, and they're kind of sitting there, they're kind of being a little quiet, a little dismissive towards you, but their partner is doing all the talking for them, really guiding the conversation, either downplaying it, or she does this all the time. She has a bit of a problem. I do my best to keep things calm here, and really trying to guide that and minimizing that person is one of those red flags. Also, like denying entry. If you get to the door and they're like, no, everything's fine, we don't really need you here. Just those little subtle signs. And then as you get in there, if you're looking around the room and it doesn't look like it's adding up, something's probably not right there at all. I'm not sure where everybody's from. I know where I used to work, law enforcement responded on every EMS call. They were actually certified EMTs as well. But I know across the country that's not the way. And if you're seeing things that aren't right, finding a quiet way to make sure they respond in. But when they're being quiet, also some other things are like the memory's not going to be there. So especially if they were strangled, they're not going to have the ability to recall things in chronological order. So it's going to kind of sound like this story doesn't add up when they tell you, because of what's happening to the brain in that moment. And so they're not going to be able to recall certain details. They might only be able to remember some like peripheral things that you might think aren't important, but really trying to listen to what they're saying is very important. And just body language, how they're behaving, they may not want to speak to us. So,
to your point, one of the most scared I've ever been on a call, actually, because I was surprised. We responded to a small apartment, ground level apartment, for a headache. And we knocked on the door, and a woman answered it very quickly, and all the lights were off. And she shushed us really quickly, like, shh, hey, 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 you're gonna wake him up. We were like, oh, okay. And there was a man asleep right there on the floor, and she was really timid. Her body language, kind of projected that she was afraid of this person, and she kind of quickly got her coat and her purse and came outside. And that's right when the fire department pulled up, and we kind of gave them like, hey, we're good, kind of nod. We went and got her in the back of the ambulance and started doing an assessment, and then there was a big knock at the back door of the ambulance, and I thought it was one of the firefighters because we had just interacted with them. And I opened it, and it was the man from inside, and all of a sudden I was between him and the woman. And nothing was really said, but you could tell this is a very unhealthy relationship. I don't know what's going on. And it was, even the firefighters picked it up. They were all getting out of their fire truck like, whoa, what's this guy going to do? And when he saw that, he just kind of said, where are you going? And she said, the hospital. He's like, okay, I'll come get you, you know? And in hindsight, absolutely, completely aligned with everything you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Typically answering the questions or wanting to stand like over the top, hearing everything that's going on is a big one, just like you said, and just that body language from them, right? And I think an important thing for us is to not challenging him in that moment, right? Trying to be careful and not escalate it with our behavior and our body language, because we can make it worse. It might not be worse in that moment, but later on, when she comes back home, if he thinks that she disclosed anything that he didn't want her to, he's certainly going to challenge her on that one when she gets home, and it can be very, very bad, if not very lethal. The thing about domestic violence is typically it's known as a private issue. It happens behind closed doors. And these abusers are very good at it. They know how to behave a certain way when other people are around, out in public. They can appear to be like a pillar of affinity. Everybody loves them, but they choose to abuse behind closed doors. And so they're going to look oftentimes, and you can see it in the body cam footage in Moab with Brian. He was the good guy. I'm just trying to keep things calm here. Sometimes she gets a little worked up. What can I do to help you? I'm going to buddy up with you, because they oftentimes aren't going to come out and be aggressive in front of you. And so that's how they're going to be behaving. But they're also doing it for a reason, and they're watching very closely to make sure that person they're abusing isn't going to say or do anything that is going to threaten them in any way. They're going to try to change, the abuser's going to try to change the narrative the best they can. They might be manipulate evidence or the scene to make it benefit them in their way. So I'm just kind of picking up on those things. Those little cues is really important.
And you had mentioned earlier that sometimes you may go on this call without police. So like Will's scenario on this call without police, with these, red flags that he's seeing that you just alluded us to, how do you recommend we go about tipping people off to that red flag?
So I've heard some really interesting ways that some agencies can call for law enforcement assistance when they realize something's not right. I tell folks all the time when I'm out there training, we all have these fancy $8,000 radios, right? Everybody gets one of these really fancy radios. So we're all walking around with them. And if I key up and I transmit on my radio, it's transmitting on everybody's. And if I left the PA on the ambulance or whatever, it's broadcasting in the whole neighborhood. And so who might hear that? The person who's the abuser, right? And that can escalate the scene. So using that radio might not be the best means. So I've heard agencies say, go get the purple bag out of the ambulance, or call the dispatcher, just let them know that we have a code purple or something like that. And it's a protocol that they have between their dispatchers and themselves saying, hey, notify law enforcement. Or maybe in that instance too, having somebody walk out and use their cell phone to contact dispatch and say, hey, this is what was going on. Something's not right here. We'll have law enforcement respond out. Don't come over the radio with it, falling back on this number, but not broadcasting it where the person can hear. So I usually leave it up to individual agencies to know what might work best for them. But whether it's a radio cue, just a word, or picking up that phone is probably the best way.
Yeah, some sort of code that is understood between your EMS agency, dispatch, as well as law enforcement, so that you don't necessarily have to have an out loud conversation of, I'm worried about domestic violence here, but they can actually respond in knowing that's what you're worried about without you ever actually having to say that out loud.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, I talk about all the time. One of the things I through my research I found was back in 2004, Lieutenant Brenda Cowan of the Lexington, Kentucky Fire Department was shot and killed in the line of duty responding on a domestic call. And another firefighter was also shot and injured that day. And I'm ashamed to say that, like, I just learned a few years ago about a line of duty passing. And we study these often anytime there's a line of duty death. One of the biggest things that came out of her line of duty death, out of that NIOSH report, was the need for coordinated interagency communication, like the ability for us to be able to talk between law enforcement, fire, EMS, dispatch, have updated information, but also to come together and train together. And not just that once a year, like doom and gloom, the world is coming to an end drill. The 747 crashes into the orphanage next to the chemical plant. We have like all of our stuff in a parking lot and check our boxes, eat some pizza and drink a soda. And then like, all right, we'll see you guys next year. I'm not saying that those drills are not important. They are, but coming together on the everyday calls that we're responding to on a regular basis, calls for violence in general, oftentimes that's one of those calls that we're going to end up in court for maybe one day. And it's not going to be immediately. It could be 2-3 years later. And so like your documentation is all you have. So understanding what law enforcement needs from us and what they can expect, on the other side from us responding and having that communication. So the first time we're having this conversation isn't on scene when it's potentially escalating. So working together consistently and understanding these dynamics, understanding when we have these procedures and these mutual aid agreements or SOPs that we build out, that we're all very, very familiar with it. So when we get there, you have that look versus, that unspoken language like, hey, we need you here, something's not right. And if we're doing it in training, it should be seamless in real life.
You mentioned that documentation piece, which I think is going to give a lot of our providers some anxiety when they're actually doing the job and the shift. And so I want to come back to that in a little bit, but I also want to go back to a piece you said about our ability to connect with that person more so than anyone else on scene. Talk to us a little bit about how we can best connect with these individuals.
Absolutely. So trauma informed is the word that we hear often. So what does trauma informed really mean? It means be nice, non-judgmental, interested in what they're saying, concerned for them, and empathetic. And when we think about that last word, empathy, we're taught like, hey, listen, don't get emotional and connected, right? And if you look at the definition of empathy, it means going on an emotional journey. We can make a connection with them on an empathetic level without getting emotionally attached to show that we care. And it's just reframing our language, reframing our questions to be more victim-centric, avoiding like blaming questions like why, what, where, things like that. Try to ask more open-ended questions to invite a narrative, allow them to kind of control the pace of it. So instead of saying, did he hit you? Hey, I'm seeing some injuries on you that seem a little bit inconsistent, a little bit troublesome. Can you tell me a little bit more about how that happened? Versus, did somebody hit you? You might just get a yes, no, or you might not get any answer, but allowing them to kind of be more open-ended, allow them to take pauses. I know sometimes we get very uncomfortable with silence, but giving them time to really answer, it allows their brain to start slowly going back into that prefrontal cortex, into that rational brain, allows them to start gaining control of themselves, starts giving them some power back. It's really, really important. And for us, documentation is key. I know it's always a stickler for us, QA and PCRs and stuff. So, no, great. My PCR got pulled up. And all we have is our documentation. And what we write can make or break oftentimes how these calls go. And it's important for them to know that you're not documenting from an investigative standpoint, but you're documenting a thorough history of what you saw on the scene, It's what you saw and not as you observed it, not assumed. You're writing injuries as you see them. And also very important because most times they don't want to go to the hospital for so many reasons. We have that RMA, right? That refused medical attention, which that refused word I don't really like. I wish they would change it to like decline or something, or against medical advice. Where's the reasons why? Because if for some reason this does go to court later on, if an attorney's sitting there looking at refused medical attention with a very little narrative in there, case can get dismissed very easily. And so really explaining in there, a patient allowed us to do a field assessment upon physical exam. I noted X, Y, and Z, whatever injuries they might have been, signs, symptoms in there. I advised the patient that they should be seen at the hospital for some more tests. I explained to them the risks and potential lethal outcomes if they do not go, despite this patient declined transport because they didn't have anybody to watch their children. Advised them to call us back if they need us or go to the ER on their own. And that looks a lot different than like refuse transport. So just being very, very careful on how we document it. Also being careful on how we're documenting injuries. If we see what appears to be fingernail marks, like on the neck, don't write their fingernail marks because unless you have, any certifications in forensic medical examinations, how do you know they're fingernail marks? I would put like half moon abrasions, parallel, down the neck or with however you document it, not specifically fingernails. So just being really intentional on how you're documenting it.
Yeah, I think that piece is really important that you just mentioned, in that just being very objective about what you saw. So you are not the investigator. You're not investigating this. You're not adding conjecture of bruises consistent with X, Y, or Z. Just document what you saw and explain very clearly and plainly the very objective findings you saw, and just stay objective and don't add assumptions or things like that.
100%. Never put any assumptions. It's all very, very objective. If we're on the same page, what happens oftentimes with the person who's experiencing domestic violence is oftentimes if the perpetrator, the police have probable cause to make an arrest, 9 times out of 10, the victim is going to recant or change the story or not show up to court, most times because they're afraid or the person did something to coerce them into doing it, jailhouse phone calls or whatever it is. If the situation is that bad and the assault was that severe, prosecutors can still move forward without a victim if they can prove a few things. And so there are things that a victim says to us in the process of us providing medical care to them that can be an exception to hearsay and can still be admissible in court, even without that victim. It's a medical exception to hearsay. So they could still use our documentation if need be to still move forward with the prosecution. And it's important to know, like, we're not documenting for that purpose, but just know that it can happen. And there's a good chance that you will get called in on it. And again, it's not going to be right away. It'll be 2-3 years later, going on thousands of calls. All you're going to have is what you documented to try to remember that call. If it wasn't something that really stuck out to you, that where you would just remember it automatically. It's all you have is that documentation. And being as objective as possible, as thorough as possible, is of the utmost importance.
You've mentioned that strangulation piece a few times now. Can you talk to me a little more about the importance of these, choking incidents?
Yeah, absolutely. So oftentimes it's downplayed. A victim will say, well, he just kind of choked me a little bit. So it's strangulation, and strangulation is impeding the regular flow of blood and oxygen to the brain. And it can be done through various means. So from around the neck, using your hands, a device, restricting the flow in the carotid arteries and the jugular veins. It could be asphyxiation, smothering the mouth or nose. It can also be done aquatically with water or waterboarding, things like that, chemical asphyxiation, ligature devices like ropes or belts, things like that. And it is a very, very common tactic that abusers use because they consider it pretty much the perfect crime. And the large majority of domestic violence victims will tell you that they've been strangled at least one time in their abusive relationship. And if an intimate partner puts their hands around your neck even one time, they're at a 750% higher chance of being murdered by them. It's not a matter of if, but when. And the reason why they do it is they can bring you within an inch of your life or take your life and never leave an external mark on your body. Less than 50% of the people that have ever been strangled have any external marks on their body. And the marks that they do have, sometimes they don't show up right away. It might be days later, or so minimal that you could barely even photograph them. But yet, they can kill you in a very short period of time. And so stranglers know this. They know it. They know they can get away with it. They know how difficult it is to prove. Oftentimes, the person who's abusing, who's strangling, will have marks on themselves because the person is fighting for their life that they're abusing. They're single-handedly some of the most dangerous people who walk the face of the earth. When we look at mass shooters in this country, a large majority of them have documented history of strangulation. The Sutherland Springs church shooter in Texas had a documented history of strangulation. Like, the list can go on and on. Who kills law enforcement in the line of duty more than anybody else? They get killed more often on domestic violence calls, perpetrators with a history of strangulation. And it's a form of a felony in almost all 50 states. And yet 95% of the people who are charged with it are never convicted and put away because of how difficult it is to prove. And when we go up to something like this, we're very visual people. We're looking at things, and if somebody's walking and talking, they seem like they're okay, it's 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. Okay, sign here, call us back if you need us. And it's very easy to miss these things. And the signs are often not there. And the symptoms are something that can be excused as something else very easily. But they seem like they're so vague or it's not really that important or not life-threatening that we can find any reason to dismiss it. But if we don't get into the hospital, it's what they really need, they could die. And it could be days, it could be weeks later. And some of the things that they can experience are like carotid dissections, traumatic brain injuries, anoxic seizures, strokes, damage to the airway. The list goes on. And a lot of times I follow the news a lot, and I'll see it where law enforcement responded, EMS responded to this residence for a domestic violence incident. The person had just like a small hematoma on their head, didn't want to go to the hospital. 3 days later, a friend went to go check on them at their home, and they found them deceased. And so when I talk about strangulation with our responders, I kind of related to if I'm going to do a trauma protocol with you, if I'm going to sign you off for the first time, right, and I got my little checklist with you, right, okay, scene safety, BSI, blah, 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 we go through, here's your trauma scenario. I'm going to give you a distracting injury, right? I'm going to give you that grotesque bone, open fracture sticking out of the leg. And I want you to go through and do your initial assessment. And I want you to come upon that distracting injury. And I want you to acknowledge it. And I don't want you to get fixated on it, because I want you to go back and do that detailed physical exam, because that person might have, internal bleeding, right? Or a collapsed lung or a head injury. And if I don't go back and do that full assessment, I might miss the life-threatening condition. On a strangulation call, the distracting injury is the lack of physical injury. And so if I don't go and look at those subtle signs or symptoms, I'm going to miss the severity of it every time. And so it's just very simple things like, raspy voice, constantly clearing in their throat, tendinitis, ringing in the ears, dysphagia, anything with the airway, difficulty breathing, the lack of memory is a big one. Do they urinate or defecate, or have the urge to? Are important questions to ask, because those indicate a very, very severe strangulation incident. And so asking those questions and making sure we're marking that down and really getting them to the hospital. What they need is to get to the hospital, hopefully one with a sane nurse or a sexual assault nurse examiner. It doesn't have to be a sexual assault, but they're certified in forensic medical evaluations for people who are strangled as well. And they really need a CTA scan. They need that CT scan with dye to check to make sure that there's nothing going on in the brain and the neck. And if there is, they're in the right place to get that stuff taken care of. Because if they don't, it can be fatal for them.
Yeah, that's one of, for me as an emergency physician, the emergency department is one of the things that was always on the forefront of our minds when we're evaluating a strangulated patient who is otherwise well appearing at this time is there a potential for a carotid artery injury or dissection that could potentially cause a devastating stroke down the road if not caught and anticoagulated appropriately. It's a very challenging thing to pick up and recognize. There's been a fair amount of research into it, and I'll try to find those studies and link in the show notes, but it's still challenging and somewhat anxiety provoking as an emergency physician in the emergency department.
And I want something you said to sink in for a lot of people, that 750 times more likely to then experience a lethal strangulation event. I mean, that is breathtaking how much higher those odds are. Imagine putting that in the context of other injury patterns we see. Imagine if I told you, if I found you with a broken wrist, you'd be, 7.5 more times to be found dead later. I mean, you would be looking at everyone's wrist differently. And so think about that in the context of responding to these calls where, giving the example of mine, something piqued our interest. We knew something wasn't right once we were alone with that female, the patient, and she had a headache, that alone too. Like, we didn't ask the right questions. If we had gone down this route of asking about strangulation, would we have potentially uncovered an event? Who knows? But being like you were saying, Jim, like knowing these predictable patterns, this knowledge is incredibly powerful for folks.
Yeah, absolutely. When once I got this information and I started recognizing even those non-physical forms of abuse, those power and control dynamics, when I'm out and about now, because I travel a lot, I pick up on it like that. I see it all the time. And I've actually quietly at times, kind of intervened a little bit if it was safe to do so. But once you start hearing this information, like wow, like how come I never heard about this before? How come I didn't know about this? And for us, we're very, very visual. And, when we're going to a trauma call, when we see something that's either a severe bleed or something like that, you're like, oh, I can fix this, or a broken leg, or I can splint that, I can fix that. And then, some of these ones, strangulation is so subtle. You're like, yeah, it can't be that bad, right? But it is, and we have a little petechiae, like hemorrhaging, around the face and the neck. Sometimes we can dismiss it as, a skin condition, something like that. Maybe they have acne or something like that, right? Or those little symptoms, as we got a raspy voice. Well, she's upset. She's been crying. Maybe it's that, But like asking them, like, is this how your voice normally sounds? You sound a little raspy. You seem to be like you can't catch your breath. You're kind of coughing a lot. Is there any discomfort in there? And kind of asking those questions, because there could be definitely some serious injury going on in there in that airway as well, with the larynx and vocal cords and everything else. So it seems so subtle. It seems like it's not, but it really can have a fatal outcome. It doesn't take very much pressure to the neck at all, to include those arteries, those carotid arteries, or those jugular veins. I have a good friend that she came up with a strangulation supplement for law enforcement on scene for how they document it. And I've probably read over 500 of those, to the point now when I read it, I can tell you exactly how that person was strangled. They were standing behind her and had her like this, or had her this way, or grabbed her like that, or like this. Reading knowing how my daughter was murdered, she died by manual strangulation, throttling, and blunt force trauma. And so oftentimes the hyoid bone is something that can be injured under here for somebody if they're strangled. It's basically like a cartilage-like material, right? It's very, very frail. But for our daughter, she had bilateral styloid fractures, and the styloids are on the side. They actually found it in her hair. And so I know that he had her like this, strangling her from the side, and probably slamming her head off or something. And that's how he killed my daughter. I can read them now, and I know exactly how it occurred. If I'm seeing petechiae hemorrhaging, then I know the jugular veins were probably occluded in some way. So carotids were pumping that blood up. We're not allowing the deoxygenated blood away. So we're building pressure and boom, we start to get that petechiae. So I read these things now and I'm like, oh man, I pick up on it so quickly. And so it's very prominent. It happens all the time. Strangulation is even like normalized for younger kids in sexual intercourse and stuff. It is dangerous. In my opinion, it's attempted murder because it can kill you and it will kill you. And it can cause irreversible damage each time you do it. And yet it's not treated as serious as it should be.
The petechiae you mentioned too can just be found in the palate, right, in the oral pharynx. So taking a look at that soft palate and hard palate as well.
Yeah, upside down, looking underneath here for injuries, looking inside the mouth. So you could have the petechiae inside, looking for like things like cuts on the tongue or anything like that, or any trauma inside the mouth. So we want to be looking inside as well. They might have it in their eyes as well. So really paying attention. And it's important to know too that also persons of color will not necessarily show some of these actual signs the same as everybody else because of the increased amount of melanin in their skin. TPI might not present as prominent for others and can be easily dismissed. And so oftentimes when we're responding to these calls, we're more likely to miss the actual physical signs of strangulation, persons of color versus somebody with a lighter complexion. And so understanding and looking at those calls and realizing, in general, if we were going to a person of color who's having difficulty breathing, they might not present as cyanotic like I would. So what other ways are we looking to see if they're being adequately perfused? Checking the nail beds, inside the eyes to make sure. So it's the same with them. With that, it's not going to be as prominent. You're more likely to miss it. So really making sure we're doing a detailed exam and asking really specific questions about is this noticing some patterns on you? Here's that you're normal. Is that normal for you? It almost looks like bruising. Can you tell me a little bit more about that? And kind of really digging a little deeper into that to make sure we're not missing something.
Yeah, it's really important to know. Speaking about other things that we were not taught, when I was a paramedic, at least, I never knew something like a sexual assault nurse examiner existed or a SANE nurse. So if there are any other listeners out there who are not aware of this, can you just tell us what that individual is and what they do?
Yeah, absolutely. So I have a lot of respect for nurses in general for the work they do. They pretty much, to me, they run the hospitals, right? But a sexual assault nurse examiner is a really special person. And I don't know how they do what they do. And so they are specifically trained to do forensic medical examinations on people who have been sexually assaulted or even people who have been strangled, going through basically doing like the rape kits and all that stuff and documenting everything from a very objective standpoint. They go through specific training for adults and pediatric patients to be able to do that. And there's, unfortunately, we have to have them because this occurs, but there's also not enough of them because of the amount of instances we're having across the country. But they are an unbelievable resource and learning where they are located because they're not in every hospital, not in every county. Knowing where they are around us, I think, is important. Or if they have the ability to respond to a different hospital if need be, is really huge because they go above and beyond with their medical examination than a typical nurse in an ER setting.
And I think another important point is that this may be the only contact this individual has with healthcare, right? Like there may not be another follow-up, there may not be another chance.
No, you might be the one and only chance they have. And I always say if we make the right impression the first time, that might be it. It's incredibly frustrating, these calls. It's incredibly frustrating for law enforcement, for families who know somebody who's going through it. You just kind of want to like rip them out of that situation. Come on, just go get out. It's not that easy. And so if we connect with them on that first time, it's really important. It's paramount in that response to them. Because if we get to them that first time, hopefully that'll prevent that second, third, fourth, or fifth call there, and potentially the fatal one, which is far too common. So just making that connection with them is important. I look back on my career, and we had a patient that we would get repeatedly. I can't even tell you how many times, until the final time we had her when she was murdered. And because she was part of the unhoused community, we didn't look at every instance where she called us as domestic violence related, when each one of those was actually a silent cry for help from her. And I look back on that and I'm like, man, I did such a disservice to that woman because I didn't know. It was like I was aggravated, thinking, oh, she's calling again, but not knowing the true dynamics of what she's going through. And so I look back and think to myself, well, maybe if you connected with her in the first time, maybe we could have helped get her out of that. So I don't want anybody else to have that in their career and their life. I live with a lot of guilt to this very day. Guilt as a father who failed to protect his daughter. A lot of guilt for failing in my mission as a first responder because I didn't bring her home. And then I live with this guilt as well of unintentionally failing some of the people that our job is to do no further harm to by not knowing. And so if we can educate our folks, we can hopefully prevent similar tragedies from happening.
This is why it's so important to be informed on this topic and these calls, because you do have an opportunity to save someone's life. As insignificant as your comments or your care may seem in the moment, realizing these numbers and the prevalence and the impact that altering somebody's next steps may have carries real weight and meaning. I think by knowing this and doing those things, we give the patient the best opportunity. We can feel better about the fact that we were able to give the patient the best opportunity to get help and leave that situation. I think one of the hardest parts of this job is, despite doing all of these things, knowing all of these things, and giving that patient the best opportunity, they may still make a bad decision. And that it's just so hard as an emergency clinician. Do you have any words for that?
Yeah, it's something that we see often, that despite our best efforts, sometimes it's not enough. It's a hard thing to grapple with. But these are highly complex calls. They're not easy. I'll give you an example. Even when a person who's being abused does everything right. There's a case going on right now out of Columbus, Ohio. Monica and Spencer Tebby. Monica was severely abused by her first husband, and she divorced him. She recognized it. She left. Finally helped her get out. She moved on. And mind you, her ex was a doctor. She moved on. She remarried Spencer, a dentist. They went on to have a family, 2 kids together. She was out of that abusive relationship for 9 years. And in December, Monica and Spencer were found murdered in their home in Columbus, Ohio, in front of their 2 children. And law enforcement arrested the suspect, her ex, from 9 years ago. And so we got asked the question by a friend who's a reporter if we were surprised by this. And we said, am I surprised that an ex-intimate partner murdered their estranged wife? No, unfortunately, it happens every day. So what did surprise me was when the police chief for Columbus came out and called it a domestic violence incident, because people were like, how could this be domestic violence? They were divorced for 9 years, and there really is no timeline for it. And I say, I don't know all the information, and I don't want to speculate, but I can guarantee you over the course of that 9 years, he couldn't let it go. He couldn't live without her. And he continued to stalk and harass her and cause harm and emotionally abuse her, even though she had moved on. She had done everything right. And 9 years later, he's arrested for taking her life. And so that is really a horrible example of just what these individuals will do, will go to. If I can't have her, nobody can. And we can be doing everything right. We can document everything properly. We can get them transported. We can treat the injuries. We can get them to resources. Prosecutors can lock them up for a certain amount of time, but some of these abusers are just so bad, such terrible people that despite all of our efforts, they still manage to kill. So I think by educating like we are, starting with our youth, really explaining to our children what a healthy relationship looks like, what boundaries are, how to treat each other, even in our friendships. If somebody's not being respectful to you as a friend, well, they're not really a good friend. Maybe that's not somebody you want to surround yourself with. How to be supportive and understanding of someone going through this stuff. And really, I think the biggest thing is for us men to really start speaking up about it. The majority of abusers are men, but most men aren't abusers. There's more good men out there than good men standing up and standing with these organizations, with these women that have been abused and saying, we're going to help, we're going to protect you. This isn't right, and falling out the bad behavior from the bad ones. I think maybe then we can see some real change.
You mentioned there's no timeline, and I think that's really important to realize. But I think another really important thing to realize, at least what I've heard, is that the most dangerous time period for these victims is immediately after they decide to leave.
Yeah. So over 70% of domestic violence homicide occur when a victim is either attempting to leave or has separated from them because now that abuser has lost control, lost power, right? And so that is the time when we start to see the majority of the homicides. We believe Gabby, that she was done on August 27th when he had killed her. And he couldn't take that. And so just leaving isn't the right way. It takes a very, very detailed and specific safety plan to safely get them out, which there is no blanket one for all, because each one is a little bit different, but really safety planning for them to get out. And so, when you hear things like, why don't we just leave? Well, at least I know where he is, when I'm here, or I know how to control the situation, or, if the beating wasn't as bad as the last one, I mean, he would stop. Like, that doesn't sound reasonable to somebody who's not being abused. But for them, in their brain, which is severely reprogrammed and traumatized, that is them rationalizing and knowing how they're keeping themselves safe, knowing how to navigate that. And anybody on the outside is looking at that, judging, going, "Oh my God, that's the craziest thing I've ever heard." Just leave. It's not the safest way. It's not the safest way sometimes.
Yeah, understanding that their brain is in that moment actually reprogrammed to protect themselves, to find the best way to keep themselves alive in the current terrible situation they found themselves in.
Dr. Jim Hopper, he's out of the Boston area, has a website and a YouTube page. His research and work is specifically for sexual assault victims and what their brain goes through. But he also mentions in some of his videos how it applies to someone experiencing like domestic violence or maybe a natural disaster or military, first responder folks, when they're out there, and what happens to your brain when you're experiencing trauma or fear. So yeah, he has really great videos on there. And some of the videos are folks on a slingshot ride, and it's a really interesting thing to see. Like, how often do we Monday morning quarterback in our career, right? Like, if I was there, the fire would have gone out. Or if I was there, I would have done this. If I was in that situation, I would do this. No, you wouldn't. You think you would, because right now you're sitting here, you're not in danger, you're not afraid. I'm in my prefrontal cortex, my rational brain, and this is what I'll tell you I'm doing. And what he'll show you is that as much as we think we have control over our brain in every situation, we don't. So we have that part of our brain, that defense circuitry, the amygdala and the hippocampus and hypothalamus in there, which is basically binoculars that's always scanning for danger. And that has been put into our brain since like the beginning of evolution. Because if we didn't have that defense mechanism, like fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, even submission, negotiation, all sorts of other things that come into it as well, we would cease to exist, right? We would be gone. And so our brain developed this defense circuitry in there, and it's always on, it's always scanning for danger. And on a regular basis, if the average person's walking around at like a 2 out of 10 on a scale of danger, a person who's experiencing abuse, they're like on an 8. And so they're always in that defense circuitry part of their brain where they dump cortisol and adrenaline and things like that. And that has a long-term detrimental effect on us. And it doesn't allow us to be in our prefrontal cortex and make rational decisions sometimes. And so oftentimes the brain will do things to protect us in that moment. And we'll see it a lot in these like sexual assault cases where they'll go into a state of tonic immobility. And, they'll ask, did you fight back? No. Well, why not? I couldn't. What do you mean you couldn't? I couldn't move. Okay, do you remember what the person looked like? No, I don't remember. But what's the last thing you remember? Well, I remember they grabbed me, they threw me to the ground. And then I remember looking up, and on the wall was a clock. And the hour hand was on 1, and the minute hand was on 45. And the second hand was ticking, but it wasn't moving. And it ticked 280 times. And then there was a crack on the wall right above that. I'm like, okay, well, can we talk more about the assault? That's all I remember. And that's their brain taking them away from what they're experiencing in that moment to protect them. And if we listen closely, it actually gave you a lot of information. If you counted 280 ticks, that's 280 seconds. How long did it occur? Okay, can you tell me approximately where this occurred? Well, it was here. And then can we find the room? Can we go into that room? There's the clock. There's the crack on the wall. And so we've corroborated some of that information that this occurred, but they're not necessarily going to remember the specifics of it because their brain was protecting them. And so for us as first responders, our brain goes into reflex and habit, right? And we try to mimic our trainings to be specifically stressful. So you will hopefully be able to rely on your reflex and your habit. That's why we do things repeatedly over and over again. So it becomes muscle memory. But even us, when we go through that, we can go to a potentially very stressful, traumatizing call where we can freeze up. What happens to law enforcement? They don't interview law enforcement. God forbid they were in a police-involved shooting immediately afterwards because they know the memory is not going to be there. So they wait 48 to 72 hours now to interview them because they understand the brain won't remember it, that the memory bank is shut down. You aren't in the prefrontal cortex. You can't remember things in chronological order. And so we go into a situation where somebody's been abused, where their brain has been protecting them. And I want who, what, where, when, why, and how, and I want it now. And when we don't get it, we get frustrated. If they're lying to us or they're being difficult, they're not. If they're experiencing trauma, being very careful how we speak to them is huge. And I really recommend, I probably did a disservice by trying to explain how he does it in such an amazing way, but definitely check out his website. It's really something to check out and see and understand it. And it's something I use in my trainings often because it's important to know. If we want to understand people experiencing abuse, we have to understand the brain.
What was the name of that website one more time?
He is Dr. Jim Hopper.
We'll throw the link in the show notes if you send that over to us.
Yeah, I'll send that over to you.
I'm going to wrap it up. Anything else you want to talk about or that we missed before I jump into the wrap up?
No, I mean, I know we covered a lot today. When I first started doing this domestic violence training, being a former instructor, developing a program wasn't hard. And I'm like, how am I going to talk about this? Do I have enough content to fill an hour, 2 hours? And now my trainings have gotten into 4 and 8 hours, and they're really involved with stuff. I can take any one of these topics today and spend the day talking about it. They're all very important. And I just hope that, providing this information, getting the information out there to folks, we start to look at these incidents a little bit differently, realizing that we've got to take a little extra care on them. And we really have the opportunity to make a big difference. Make sure, if you're not familiar with the resources in your area or where to refer to, domesticshelters.org is a good site to go to. You can type in your address on there and it'll tell you the local domestic violence, sexual assault organizations in your area. There's also the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which is 1-800-799-SAFE, or you can text the word START to 88788 and start that conversation for somebody who might be experiencing abuse. And these are oftentimes very triggering conversations. With the prevalence of domestic violence, oftentimes people in my room are finding out for the first time that they're in an abusive relationship or they have previously been in one and it can be triggering. So if somebody's going through it, just know that you're not alone. It's not your fault. There are resources in the safe way out.
Yeah, and Jim, I want to speak one last time to just the power of knowledge like this. Ross and I teach a class called the Paramedic Confidence Builder class, and part of that is we discuss cases. Paramedics join from all over the country and Canada, and they're in it to try to make themselves better at this job. And one of the students recently brought forth a case where they were caring for a female patient in a bedroom, and a male from on the scene started watching. And in order to try to give that patient some privacy, our student kind of went up and not forcefully put his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "Hey, give us some privacy, please." And that man lashed out against him in violence. And our student, you know, is reflecting well, thinking like, "Oh man, how did I escalate this? What could I have done differently?" and all that, which is all great thinking too. But with knowledge like what you're giving us and what you're equipping us, you can also recognize that's a significant red flag. This this man wanted to be involved in her care. He wanted to see what was happening. He wanted to know exactly what she was saying. And when they asked him to remove himself, he violently lashed out and refused. The little bit of knowledge that you've equipped us with today helps us now see something like that in a completely different light and have a better understanding of the potential circumstances that are taking place.
Absolutely. And there's something that's on the horizon that we should all be looking out for, and that's the proposed changes to NFPA 455. NFPA 455, some of the proposed changes that they're looking to do is because of the amount of EMTs and paramedics being injured or killed in the line of duty by violence, whether it's a mental health call, substance abuse call. They don't specifically name domestic violence in there. They're looking to put additional requirements in there training wise. So one of those is de-escalation training for instances like that. And we're also talking about self-defense training. So requiring that. So, I mean, just some stuff coming down the line, but it's the higher ups are starting to recognize that there's a danger to us as well. And what are we doing to help protect ourselves? And I think arming ourselves first with the knowledge of these scenarios and these instances is huge, and staying ahead of that. So our safety is paramount. We want to go home to our families too. We know it's a dangerous job that we signed up for, but I became a firefighter because I didn't want to carry a gun and worry about ever having to use that. And a law enforcement officer does. And to be where we are now, where we have ballistic gear on our ambulances, on our fire trucks, talking about de-escalation training and self-defense training now, the world is changing and it's a scary place. And so, just always keeping your head on a swivel and having good situational awareness is huge.
Well, thank you. Before Ross speaks, to wrap us up, I just want to say again, thank you for everything you've brought in terms of knowledge and training. And also, it's all inspiring to know your story with Gabby and to see how you are turning such an experience into something that can benefit other people. So thank you.
Thank you. And you can catch me at the FDIC too. I have a session there this year. So, and for additional information, they can check out GabbyPetitoFoundation.org. You can email us at info@GabbyPetitoFoundation.org if you have questions or you'd love us to come out for training. So thank you. I thank you guys today.
Absolutely. There is more to know about this, as we just mentioned. And so look into the foundation, go get some more training, education, check out the resources that Jim just mentioned. There's a quote that I often go back to, which is never waste suffering. Suffering is inevitable and it will happen in this life, but if we do nothing with it, then that's all it is wasted pain. And so it's amazing to see the work that you have done out of this suffering, the good that you have provided the EMS community and all of those others. So yes, as Will said, thank you so much for the work you do. Thank you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to chat with us and come onto the show and educate our listeners. You're currently at your hotel in Arizona, about to travel to California, all within doing this great work here. So thank you so much.
Thank you guys. I really appreciate this opportunity. It just means a lot to us, being able to turn our pain into purpose. It's huge. And it's not easy. Today would have been Gabby's 27th birthday. And she's forever 22. But I can't think of any better way to honor her any day, but especially today, trying to continue to raise awareness and help others do better, and for us to really combat this issue. So, thank you.
Wow. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much. Jim Schmidt turned the worst thing that ever happened to him into a mission. That is not an easy thing to do, and most people do not. What we want you to do with this episode is simple. This week, one thing, go find your agency's domestic violence protocol or policy. Read it. Don't skim it, but actually read it and know it. Know what is required of you on scene before the next domestic violence call lands on your radio. And if you do not have one, which I actually think is probably the majority of people listening to this right now, that is information too. Talk to your medical director, talk to your supervisor, tell them what you heard today. Share this episode with them so they can understand the importance of having a plan, of educating, of knowing what you should do in these moments and having it written out and educated to the providers. The goal is not to turn you into a social worker. That is not your job. Your job is assessment, documentation, and safety, both yours and the patient's. And right now there is a gap between what most providers know how to do on a domestic violence scene and what actually needs to happen. One call, one set of eyes trained to look differently. That is getting 1% better. It does not feel like much on the day you are standing in somebody's living room at 2 a.m. But ask Jim what difference 1% makes. It is everything. If this episode hit home, share it with your crew, your partner, your shift supervisor. Put it in your department's group chat if you have to. This is one of those topics that does not get enough airtime. And people like Jim are doing the work to change that. We'll see you on the next one. In the meantime, stay safe out there.